In 1989, two brothers walked into their parents' Beverly Hills mansion and ended their lives with a shotgun. 36 years later, one of those brothers sat in front of a California parole board, finally eligible for freedom for the first time in his life. And he was told no. But here is the part that almost no headline got right. The reason the board said no had almost nothing to do with that night in 1989. For more than 3 decades, the Menendez case has been argued over a single question. Were Erik and Lyle Menendez cold, calculating killers who murdered their parents for a fortune? Or were they two abused sons who finally broke? Everyone has picked a side. Books, documentaries, dramas, endless debate. So, when the parole board finally sat down to decide Erik's fate, you would expect that question to be at the center of everything. It wasn't. The board barely touched 1989 at all. What they focused on instead genuinely stunned the brothers' own supporters. And to understand why, you have to understand what changed in 2025. Let's go back to the beginning. Erik and Lyle Menendez were convicted in 1996 of murdering their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, inside the family's Beverly Hills home. It took 2 separate trials to get there. The first ended without a verdict. The second ended in conviction. And a sentence with no mercy built into it at all. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Think about what those words actually mean. Not life with a chance after 30 years. Not life with a review someday. Life without parole means the door is welded shut. No matter what you do, no matter how you behave, no matter how much you change, you die in prison. For almost 30 years, that was the entire story of Erik and Lyle Menendez. No appeals working, no second chances coming, nothing on the horizon. And then, in May 2025, everything shifted. A Los Angeles judge named Michael Jessic did something almost nobody expected. He resentenced the brothers from life without parole to 50 years to life. That change sounds technical, but it was enormous. Because both Erik and Lyle were under the age of 26 when the crime happened, that new sentence made them eligible for parole under California's youthful offender rules. After 35 years behind bars, for the first time ever, the welded door had a handle on it. So in the summer of 2025, the moment finally arrived. Erik and Lyle Menendez would each face the parole board, in separate hearings, appearing on a video screen from a prison in San Diego. And their legal team walked in feeling confident, genuinely confident. Because on paper, they believed they had an airtight story to tell. They had decades of material to work with. They could point to 35 years of largely calm, stable behavior. They could point to the fact that inside prison, the brothers had not faded into the background. They had built things. Erik and Lyle had helped create a support group for elderly and disabled inmates, men who were vulnerable and often forgotten inside the system. They had been involved in a fundraising and beautification project. They had taken part in programs, education, rehabilitation efforts. If you were building a case that 2 men had been transformed by their decades in prison, this was the raw material you would want. The brothers' team looked at all of it and saw the textbook definition of rehabilitation. They were ready to argue that Erik and Lyle were simply not the same people who had been convicted in the 90s. But here is what they may have underestimated. A parole board does not exist to be impressed. It does not hand out freedom as a reward for good behavior. A parole board has one job, and it weighs the bad just as carefully as the good. It weighs risk, and the board had a file of its own. A file the brothers' supporters were not nearly as eager to talk about. When Erik's hearing got underway, the commissioners did something that caught a lot of people off guard. They did not lead with the shotgun. They did not lead with the parents or the inheritance or the question of motive that the entire public still argues about. They led with something far more recent. They led with how Erik Menendez had behaved inside prison. And this is where the case turned. Over his years behind bars, Erik had been caught with contraband cell phones. Not once, more than once. Now, to an outsider, a smuggled phone might sound minor, almost forgivable. But step into the mindset of a parole commissioner for a moment. A contraband phone is not just a phone. It is a rule, broken deliberately. It is a sign that a person is still willing to operate outside the system's boundaries when it suits them. And it wasn't a single old mistake from 20 years ago. It was treated as part of a pattern, and a relatively recent one. Then the board went further. They went backwards, past the murders, all the way to Erik's teenage years, to a series of burglaries he had committed before 1989. Slowly, deliberately, the commissioners were assembling a picture. And the picture was not flattering. It was a picture of a person who, at multiple points across his entire life, before the crime and long after it, had shown a willingness to break rules and cross lines. That is a devastating thing for a parole board to focus on. Because the board's entire question is about risk and patterns. And the brothers' legal team had walked in prepared to argue about who Erik was in 1989. The board was quietly building a case about who Erik had continued to be year after year, right up to the present day. And then came the moment that landed the hardest of all. Erik Menendez was told, in plain and direct language, that he had not been the model prisoner his supporters so badly wanted to believe he was. The board found his record genuinely troubling. Not the murders, his conduct since. The decision came down. Erik was denied parole. And it was not a narrow, hopeful, try again soon denial. He was told he would have to wait years before he could even stand in front of a board again. Sit with how strange that outcome is. For 35 years, the world had debated whether Erik Menendez deserved freedom based on one shotgun, one night, one of the most infamous crimes in American history. And when the moment of decision finally came, that crime was not what stopped him. What stopped him was smaller, quieter, almost mundane by comparison. It was the steady drip of choices he kept making inside his cell. The phones, the violations, the rule-breaking. Choices that, individually, looked like nothing, but together told the board a story it could not ignore. The thing standing between Erik Menendez and freedom was not the murder that made him famous around the world. It was Erik Menendez, the prisoner, the version of him that existed long after the headlines had moved on. So why did it happen this way? Why did a parole board, looking at one of the most notorious murder cases in modern history, spend its time on cell phones instead of the crime itself? This is the part almost every piece of coverage skipped. And it is the part that actually matters. A parole board is not a courtroom. It is not there to retry a murder. It is not there to settle the argument the public has been having for 35 years. Abuse versus greed, victims versus monsters. By law, a parole board answers one narrow, specific question, and only that question. Is this person, today, right now, an unreasonable risk to public safety if released? That is the entire test. Not, was the original crime terrible? Not, has this person suffered enough? Just, are they a current risk? And once you understand that, the hearing suddenly makes sense. On that one narrow question, a 30-year-old shotgun is almost irrelevant. But a pattern of recent rule-breaking is extremely relevant. Smuggled phones, in that specific context, spoke far louder than the murders ever could. Because the phones were recent. The phones were evidence about who Erik is now. The brothers' legal team had spent months preparing to defend the past. The abuse, the trial, the story of 1989. But the board was never judging the past. It was only ever judging the present. That gap between the case the whole world argues about and the much narrower case the board is actually allowed to hear is the entire reason this hearing ended the way it did. The Menendez brothers and millions of people watching were having one conversation. The parole board was having a completely different one. But here is what you need to understand before you click away. A parole denial was never the final word in this case, not even close. There is still one person in the state of California with the power to override all of it. The board, the denial, the years of waiting, everything. One signature could change Erik and Lyle Menendez's lives overnight. The question is whether that person will ever pick up the pen. And once you look at his track record, at what he has done in cases exactly like this one, you start to understand why the brothers' team is so nervous. We break down exactly what that man can do and why his history should worry the Menendez brothers in our next video. Subscribe so it finds you the moment it goes live.